views are of, oops, I want to talk about what some of these dogmatic views are that underline and really influence community ecology and anybody going into this field. And it's going to be four main areas. The first is actually going to be conceptualizations of the nature of the soul. There's going to be a historical focus on yield and use, which is, in other words, agriculture has really driven a lot of plant ecology. The idea from community ecology that neighbors are necessarily competitors, and then a foundational idea that competition can cause species loss. So I want to talk about these first, and then I'll go into how my lab group has tried to address this. Oops. So let me start with Western philosophical influences related to these topics. And it's not necessarily the typical place that people start in explaining why they do what they do, but it's important. And the two people in particular that I want to mention are Aristotle and then Theophrastus. If you don't know, Theophrastus took over the school for Aristotle when he moved away. And they both are critical figures, even if we don't realize they're critical figures. So Aristotle, among other things, one of his big writings was on the nature of the soul. And he divided the living world, which he did include plants as living things, into having three types of souls. There was the vegetative soul, there was a sensitive soul, which went to animals, and then there was the rational soul, which only went to people. And the short of this is animals act, plants don't. Because they didn't exhibit sensitivity, they were unable to respond to local conditions. And it's far-fetched now, but this lasted for millennia, to the point that when the field of plant physiology was trying to be created, it couldn't be. It was a lot of resistance initially because plants were not sensitive, and thus they had no physiology. And this idea that plants are different in sensitivity than animals permeates modern behavioral ecology, and it fundamentally influences how we think plants should react under certain circumstances, much to the detriment of understanding. So his views still persist in our daily research, even if we don't realize it. Related then is Theophrastus, who is widely viewed as at least the Western founder of botany. He had a number of writings on plants. He's also the progenitor of the niche concept. And just so you know, if you check Combridge, if you check the, that's right, absolutely unconscious bias. If you check the Cambridge dictionary, niche and niche are both approved pronunciations. There is not one right here. Anyway, the niche concept came from him. And most importantly, when he talked about plants, he talked about plants as, in the context of what can they do for us? Their medicinal and agronomic importance. And so those two mindsets, plants don't respond and plants are useful, has driven a lot of our current thinking about plants. And those ideas directly merged into these yield-oriented disciplines such as agriculture and forestry. And those are the birthplace of modern plant biology and ecology. The oldest ecological experiment that's still going on is an agricultural experiment in England, started in 1843. The research emphasis on that experiment, but others, has been on the efficient production of food and fiber, which involves a lot of understanding of how plants work, but in a very narrow sense, particularly because, one, we wanted to increase yield, which is different than fitness. And that was the Green Revolution was essentially selection for increased allocation to reproductive structures. And then we have the modern agriculture, which is a chemical-based agriculture that's designed specifically for scalability and profit. And that uses plants as factories, such that if you give them certain inputs, you get your outputs. You need some aspects of plant biology to do that, but you don't need all of organismal biology to turn these into money machines, which is what modern agriculture is. And so agriculture and ecology are both involving plants, but they're very different. And one of the big differences is that in ecology and evolution, fitness is a relative measure, but agricultural yield is not. And so a plant can actually reduce reproduction and have a higher fitness, but it would be a lower yield. There's other more subtle things. Croplands are super simple with usually single species. And so there can be a single limiting resource, which follows what we call Liebig's law, but natural systems actually tend to be co-limited. They're inherently complex. And so all told, what these are saying is that this emphasis on improvement in the context of human need has generated a really large amount of information about a very narrow part of plant biology. We could actually step back and ask ourselves, what if all we knew about animal biology came from livestock production, or microbiology just came from culturing, I don't know, some microbe that people care about? You can realize how biased the discipline would be, not from bad intent, just a narrow focus of understanding, again, driven largely by Aristotle and Theophrastus. That said, ecologists haven't done a lot better. Ecologists love these simple models. And this goes back from Darwin to modern models by Chesson. Over and over, the theory of community ecology, and I'm really focusing on community ecology here, is driven on simplifying the system, typically taking out any biology from the models and going for average effects of stuff. Locke-Volterra competition model is one classic one that students hate in Biology 208, but it's one of the most important models in community ecology of trying to understand coexistence. And the reason for that is this single model, which was an agricultural model for fish yields in the early 1900s, has been expanded and embedded in almost every subsequent model in community ecology. So we got a couple of problems here. Ecological theory is largely free from data, and it's typically tested, if at all, in really simplified systems, such as diatoms and paramecium. It emphasizes pairwise interactions, and it focuses on systems going to equilibrium. And so it's assuming all the rules that play out and the game gets a solution. That is going to come back later here. It's also generally agnostic to which taxa are involved, meaning it doesn't have a lot of biology, typically in the models. On the other side, ecologists have some habits in our culture, and this is a paper that a postdoc and I recently wrote, that are problems too, and an ongoing project. First, what we're finding is even when you try to look for papers that are original data papers in the literature, what most people tend to cite are papers of people talking about other people's data. And so original data papers just aren't cited that often in ecology relative to people's talking. At the same time, when a study is replicated, when that ever happens, the norm in ecology is to assume that there's a third variable that wasn't measured explaining the difference. And this is a real problem, because this means we can never reject hypotheses if people just assume without showing there's a contingency. And this allows the proliferation of what Jeremy Fox in Calgary calls zombie ideas, ideas which there's not substantive support for, but people in ecology can't let go. And most of our core community ecology are, I'll assert, zombie ideas. And that's what I want to show through some examples. So I'm going to touch on three main sets of questions here. The first is going to be of, do more closely related species compete more strongly than unrelated species? This is going to come from Darwin, and Emily Holden is doing some of this work in more recently. Second is, does competition actually cause species loss? And then third is, what may actually cause coexistence? And that last one is going to be an integration of a large number of studies out of the lab. The second one is by led mostly by Charlotte Brown, who's a former PhD, and Scott Sugden, who is a master's student of Colleen and Lisa's, has been doing this work with me. So before I get into those details, this isn't going to be a surprise to most people, but I have a very experimental approach. I would say I'm biased way more towards experiments than most ecologists, and certainly most ecologists in our department. And that's not too surprising. I do work with plants. It's easier to do a lot of experiments with plants than it is animals. But even within plant ecologists, I'm on the heavy side of experimental over observational, though we do some of that. Whenever possible, we do use manipulative experiments. So we are in the field, greenhouse, or mesocosm. We add or remove or modify something. We add a pesticide, a fungicide, add nutrients, manipulate diversity, whatever. Our studies tend to run a gradient from proof of concept to does it matter. Our proof of concept work tends to be more in the greenhouse controlled systems, and then we bring it to the field to see if it has any ecological relevance relative to everything else going on out there. We do lots of scales of organization, from tissues up to global patterns. Here I'm focusing mostly on relative abundances of different species, so a classic measure of coexistence. So the first question is what we call Darwin's competition-relatedness hypothesis. And this is from Origin of Species. It's the species of the same and related genera, which from having nearly the same structure, constitution, and habits, generally come into the severest competition with each other. It's a great idea. That idea is embedded in all of the subsequent community ecology models that I'm going to talk about. They literally take this quote from Origin as a justification for their designs, and they take it as truth. And it hadn't been tested until we did this a few years back. So this is a paper we had. The graph is a little bit complicated, and it's because of the review process, but I'll just walk you through the important bits here. Each data point represents a separate study. So we put together a lot of data that had pairwise contests among species. And Darwin would have predicted a negative correlation, so below zero here, between the phylogenetic distance among the competitors and the strength of competition. So the more distance you are, the less you should compete. So that's a pretty straightforward prediction. We don't find it. So across all studies, there's no correlation. We've had through this review process, which was brutal, we had to analyze it a gazillion times, and we never found evidence that Darwin was right. We never found any relationship between relatedness and the strength of competition. And this is one of these few cases where this study has actually been independently replicated by several labs, and everybody's finding the same thing. In short, Darwin is wrong, but he's wrong for obvious reasons, such that it didn't ever need to even be assumed. What he was saying is that two grass species should compete really strongly because they're closely related, but a grass and a tree should not compete because they're really distantly related. And anybody who has trees in your yard, you know that's false. So we know from first principles, his assertion has to be wrong. And it is wrong when you actually look at it with data. But unfortunately, it's going to be one of the major bases of understanding coexistence in natural communities. We looked at it another way. And so we wanted to really push this because it is such an important idea in the discipline. And so this is a field study led by John Bennett, a former grad student, and he went out to the field and he measured the strength of competition in a natural grassland. And he measured, he had a fertilization treatment, but he also measured the phylogenetic structure of the community. So instead of just what species, are the species closely related or distantly related? And so as you go up on the y-axis here, that is becoming more clustered. So species tend to be more closely related than you expect by chance. Lower is more over dispersed. Darwin's prediction, though he wouldn't know to frame it this way, is that the more competition there is on the right, as you move to the right, the more over dispersed. You should lose more closely related species. We don't find that. What we find is the strength of competition in no way impacts whether close relatives are able to live with each other or not. So we're not able to find his pattern in the field either. And the reason for this is work that Emily is doing, where this is her COVID experiment, which was going to be a field experiment that turned into South Campus mesocosm experiment. She's now doing it in the field on her PhD. But she was looking at this idea of traits. And so Darwin argued that the reason for this evolutionary relationship should be because closely related things are more similar in form and function. And so she was able to measure the traits of the resident species in these pots, as well as plants she put in, and she could get estimates of similarity in trait space rather than taxonomic space. And it never matters. The traits similarity between the plants and residents have no impact on the amount of competitive struggle that emerged from this. And the reason for this is also something that we knew before, which is that the traits that make a plant a good or bad competitor are not phylogenetically conserved. They're convergent across the phylogenies of plants. They're really easy to evolve, it seems. And also they tend to be really plastic. These are things like plant size and growth rate. And anybody who does any plant systematics or even just descriptions of plants in the fields, you never describe plants based on leaf and root characters. It's always reproductive characters, because the reproductive characters are really conserved. All of these vegetative characters are extremely plastic, meaning lots of plants more or less are the same. And so it just doesn't make sense to think that trait similarity should cause competition. And we're finding it doesn't. Okay, so problems there from our perspectives, and there's some support from other groups. I want to turn to the more troubling one, which is this idea of this competitive exclusion principle. So leading from Darwin's work, then we moved into Gauss, who argued that multiple species cannot coexist on a single limiting resource. He tested this with paramecium, others tested with diatoms and other algae. And the idea is that one species would always cause the extinction of the other. And so this is a critical part of community ecology, that the fundamental idea is that species loss is the natural outcome of competition. And this is so different than evolutionary biology with the Hardy-Weinberg principle, where non-assortative mating maintains genetic diversity. In ecology, we actually think that loss is the norm rather than persistence. It's such that you have to explain coexistence rather than assume coexistence. It's baked into these ideas. And as we look into this a little bit deeper, what we're able to see is that in empirical studies, people rarely actually measure competition in the field. Instead, they infer it. And what I mean by that is if they see species A and B coexisting, they jump to needing to find a reason why they're able to coexist in the face of competition. What reduced competition? So they're assuming a reduction, even though it's never demonstrated. And this is really common in the literature, and it's such that you'll see it in modern writing all the time as well. Again, we have a problem, is that plants more or less eat the same things. They eat basically two types of nitrogen, one type of phosphorus, one type of water, one type of light. And so there's so few limiting resources available, yet we see species coexisting all the time. And so either there's a complicated set of reasons why coexistence is happening, or this idea that competition causes exclusion is wrong. And that's the approach that we started to test, is what if competition doesn't lead to species loss? So we tested this first in a couple ways. We did one in the local grassland, we did one in the Arctic alpine. In both locations, we measured competition and diversity, and then we did a variety of fancy and different types of statistics to try to pull apart some of the different things that might be going on. This is called a structured equation model or structural equation model, where we measured everything and we looked for the relative linkage between competition and one measure of diversity. And here it turns out to be not significant. And we measured it other ways, and we always got the same answer. We could never, although we could find lots of things that could drive species diversity, it was never competition. In the Arctic alpine, we used a whole different statistical approach called a regression tree and found basically the same result. Competition just didn't explain the diversity in these systems. Other things could, but competition couldn't. And so that was the first worrisome thing about this competitive exclusion principle once we challenged it with data. So we wanted to push this a little bit more. And so what is going on? Why might there be this misunderstanding? And one of the things we came on quickly is this idea of size asymmetry. And so ecological models like the Locke-Volterra and other ones, they typically focus on average competitive effects within and across species. So they don't really deal with individuals. They're really at the population level. And as we know, there's problems in population ecology. That's where you stand. And so what we are getting in these models is an average effect, but if individuals' ability to compete is size dependent, we can have a situation where no plant actually experiences the average effect. Instead, a large plant might be a super competitor, and a small plant might be a really bad competitor of the same species, but there's no average. And so if we build models based on average, we're not actually representing what might be going on in these systems. And so the idea is that these size advantages can create what we would consider an unfair playing field. that can itself cause species loss. In other words, if that table is rigged, then, or the game is rigged, you might get more species loss. So the expectation is that as asymmetry goes up, as there's more size dependence, we might expect a greater potential for species loss. So this was a really complicated experiment that Charlotte set up a couple of years ago, and it was a brutal design out in the field. We wanted to manipulate the size advantage. And so what she did is she went out to the field and she removed 30% of all the neighbors by biomass, not by numbers, of the small, medium, or large, targeting the small, medium, or large. And the idea is that if there's a size thing, this is going to change the size hierarchy, and we should see some effects in competition. But she was out there for weeks and weeks, one by one, pulling these plants. It was absolutely brutal. She did this with a number of focal species to start to see what happens. And the results are pretty clean, and they have just been taken by Ecology. Again, if she looks at the strength of competition versus some measure of community, here's species loss, there's no relationship. So this is consistent with what other people in lab have found. However, when she measures actually the size asymmetry of competition in the system, she starts to find the pattern. So the more size dependence there is, the greater species loss you get, rather than the strength of competition. This finding has been supported by some recent other modeling by a different group. The more modern models haven't been able to incorporate this, but it changes a bit of understanding of how coexistence could happen. Further, if we looked at the size of a plant and whether it's going to get lost, we actually saw no relationship. The expectation is small plants are more likely to be lost than large plants. It's not that way. There is no, in fact, if you go to most natural systems, there's a lot of small plants coexisting. So it's a lot more complicated than just being bigger. And what we do find, which is not surprising, is that rarer species where they have low abundances are more likely to be lost than small. And that makes a lot of sense. There's lag, and it's hard to displace a abundant species from a system in a few years. So what's going on here? Well, she's finding in that and then this other work that these size advantages aren't actually consistent among species. Some species get size advantages, some don't. Further, things such as where nutrients are in the soil can change size advantages. So these are extremely plastic among species. And even in other species, they get an advantage of being small instead of being large. And so these size asymmetries happen, but they're not as simple as you have to be taller to overshadow your neighbors. It's much, much more complicated by that. And it seems that everything can mess it up. And so the idea here is simply that nature is messy, and it prevents what we call competitive hierarchies, this predictability of these winners and losers from species interactions, because everything changes their relative placement. And so it throws all this noise into the system, which might make it harder to get these predictive changes of species loss. And that's where I'm going to continue in this next line here of what might be going on. And this is going to be Scott's and some integrative work here. So where we are so far in theory, species can go locally extinct due to competition. Fine, lots of theory for that. But the species can also go locally extinct for everything else in their n-dimensional hypervolume of a niche. In other words, they can go locally extinct because they don't have enough water, nitrogen, herbivores are too big, parasites don't have the right mutualists, whatever. There's all of these n-dimensional reasons or n-number reasons why species could go locally extinct and not coexist that have nothing to do with competition. But because of history, at least as in my view, is because of the history as I described it, we as ecologists have focused on competition. But that's not because competition is necessarily more important, but that rather that's what we've been led to believe. And there's no reason to think it is until we have data to think it is. So we have this historical emphasis on yield. We have inertia. It's really hard to dislodge influential papers. And I think part of it is, as ecology is a young science still, I think there is this conflating of respecting the founders of the discipline with evidence that their ideas are correct. It's possible many of the important founders in our discipline are just wrong when we look a little bit more closely, and there's nothing wrong with that. We're all going to be wrong in much of what we've done, and that's okay. So we wanted to push this a little bit more and look for whether we could understand a little bit more coexistence from our system. So this is a paper we're working on now, and it's a synthesis of essentially 20 years of research from my lab at a single field site at Kinsella Ranch in Kinsella, Alberta. So it's a native grassland system. I've shown some pictures already. It's fairly diverse, and there's nothing special about it other than it's one of the rare parkland grasslands, and it's on university property, which is nice. So we've been able to basically have a 200-hectare area for the last 20 years that we've been able to run a bunch of studies. And so in practice, what I've done in the lab is I've had different students come in and they were really interested in insects or mycorrhiza or resources. And the standard is, okay, go out to the field, set up an experiment where you have controls and you have treatments, and go kill something. Kill the fungus, kill the bugs, go add something, go add the fertilizer, go remove the litter or whatever. And so over these 20 years, we've had 17 different treatments being applied to the same field in different locations, but in the same field. And what's critical is that it's a fairly small area. So our species pool doesn't change. And so we have the same potential players for each of these experiments over time. And we realized that actually lets us make some comparisons. And we can actually begin to compare how different factors impact community assembly rather than trying to do it one by one, which is the traditional approach. So randomized block designs, all of these were multi-year experiments. These are dozens of graduate student theses. We measured all sorts of stuff in these. We tend to embed multiple studies in the infrastructure of these larger treatments. I'll talk mostly here, or really only here, about the community, but we also measured traits and populations and all these other things. In total, we're working with 95 species. So that sounds like a big number. It turns out Canada's grasslands are actually among the most species poor grasslands in the world. But it is what it is, and that's what's here. And most of these are actually quite native. So it's a big, messy data set. And I want to start with trying to explain what we tried to do at the beginning to begin to make sense of this. So this is many of you know, but some of you don't. This is a type of analysis called an ordination. This is a special flavor called an NMDS. That's not really important right now. And each data point here represents the community composition of a single plot in the ground in two-dimensional space. And so the only reason we need to use ordinations is because people are stupid. Natural diversity is hyperdimensional, where if you have 25 species there, we're talking 24-dimensional space to actually describe that community. And we should be able to compare things in 24-dimensional space or 95 or 94-dimensional space. But we can't do it. We don't have the mental capacity to do that. And so what we've invented instead are a series of statistical tools that simplify the natural variability so that we as humans can understand. So this is just a crutch. The only reason we use ordinations is because we can't do it the hard way. And so this is reducing the composition of these plant communities into two dimensions. And so any two data points right next to each other mean that if you look at the species abundances there, they're quite similar, and two apart mean they're quite dissimilar. So the closer proximity, the more similar they are in composition. So this is all plots, all treatments across everything. And we're going to look at the change in composition, which is going to be the differences in species types and abundances due to a treatment. And it's going to end up being the distance from the center point, which I'll show next. But we can also look at change in dispersion, which means if we have multiple plots of a treatment, are each of the plots similar to each other, such that they homogenize or do they diversify? So it's possible that some treatments actually cause the landscape to look more similar, homogenization, and other treatments might actually cause diversification or increased heterogeneity, or what we call beta diversity on the landscape. So let me walk through some of these figures here. So the first is that most things matter. There is not a single driver of species coexistence. And so the way we want to look at this is we've centered all the data. So the distance of a point from the center indicates the magnitude that a given treatment shifted the community. And from this, you can see two things. There's a few that have big effects. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Most are moderate effects. but nearly everything budged it. In fact, in all of these original papers, almost every treatment had a significant effect on community composition when you look at it by itself. There's a few exceptions, but most things did. But when you look them in this larger ecological context, the effect sizes are greatly variable. The other thing that's important is that the direction of these effects are highly variable, meaning this community shifts in every possible way depending on the treatment. And also we see blue and red, which means homogenization and diversification. That happens too. In other words, everything possible happens with certain types of treatments. What we don't see is evidence that all types of treatment, any stressor moves the community to one type. And that there's a theory, Phil Ryan put that forward, that you should have some stress adapted community types and plants. We don't find support for that. There's no stress adaptation. There's rather different community types under different treatments. When we look at just the largest effect size, these are really common things. What we're saying causes the biggest shifts in the community is drought, adding fertilizer, adding shade, or cutting your plants, clipping them, defoliation. In other words, these ideas are what grassland biologists have known for centuries are the most important. Everything in the middle are the newer things of people looking for novel findings, such as mycorrhizae and soil health, or actually competition is embedded in here. There's 3 treatments. Competition treatments have no effect really relative to these other things. And so it's interesting that we're finding adding nutrients really pushes the system, but manipulating competition itself doesn't. And so that's suggesting that there's a lot more going on here other than competition, the actual competition in terms of resources. And this is also part of what Emily's going to try to tease apart. What are the non-consumptive effects of resources that may structure communities? And I do draw that from population biology, where this ecology of fear and recognizing predation is a lot more than simply the animals being eaten. We think that's what's going on here potentially in plants too. We also find that they can have diversification or homogenization in this landscape. This is again counter to other theory. A lot of the major theory out there is that stressors have to filter species diversity, and that you have to be a certain type of species to make it through a stressor. We actually show that that's not true. We show that these blue ones do filter drought, nitrogen, clipping, such that there might not be a lot of ways to solve this problem, and that across the landscape it will become more similar. But other ones actually diversify it, including shading. And what this means is that there are a lot of different ways to solve the problem of low light. You won't get one type of community. Instead, you actually increase heterogeneity or biodiversity across the landscape when you have some of these red treatments. And so there's not a great theory for this yet, but this is what empirically we're finding, is that some treatments can canalize or homogenize the system, and other stressors actually diversify it or spread it out. And so stress may actually enhance biodiversity under some context, at least one scale of biodiversity. I'll also mention that some of these treatments that have very low effect in the direction of community shifts may have strong effects on homogenization or filtering. So there's another scale that we need to start paying a little bit more attention to. So what's going on here, and how do we think this comes back to complexity? Well, most stressors do cause these community shifts in different directions. And what this should mean is that if you have a natural system with just normal temporal and spatial variation in rainfall and nutrient inputs and grazing intensity and microbial abundances, if these things that we've manipulated, or litter layers, if these just naturally vary, that should be enough for coexistence. Because each of these move the system in different directions, which means it doesn't cause a net loss of diversity. As long as all of these axes of the niche vary in space or time, that's enough. We don't need to invoke competition. We don't need to invoke anything else. It's messy, and messiness might lead to stability. And there's other older theory on that one too, that diversity causes stability. Underlying this is that there are different solutions among and within stressors, and this that prevents there being single winners and single losers to most stressor types. Because there's ecological and evolutionary trade-offs for coping with these different things, that prevents the system from collapsing. And so the idea is that diversity itself might be a cause of coexistence, rather than diversity being the outcome of coexistence. As long as you have enough species at the start, combined with enough variability, that should be self-maintaining. And that if you simplify the system, let's think about agriculture again, or adding eutrophication, so a lot of nitrogen in precipitation, or chemical intervention, removing pests, or invasion that homogenizes the landscape, those are great ways probably to collapse the diversity of the system. So where we're going with this is beginning to propose that coexistence actually is the norm. It isn't the exception. It's only when we reduce the multidimensionality of the niche space do we begin to get into problems of species loss and big community changes. So it's a different approach than the old models. But the last little bit I want to cover is another possibility of what's going on here. And so in our work and thinking about these over the last decade or two, we've become very not keen on talking about this being a lab of competition. And the reason for that is competition is definitely one outcome of when species live together. Sure, you can compete, but it's not the only choice. And you can think about it around your neighborhood, with your neighbors. Yes, you might have this horribly antagonistic interaction with your neighbors, or you don't. You might actually have a positive beneficial interaction with your neighbors, or you might have built a big fence and you have a completely agnostic and neutral. You still have neighbors, but competition isn't the only outcome. For whatever reason, in community ecology, largely, we've focused on that as the outcome. This is Robert MacArthur and his classic work with warblers, and he began to tease that apart. And so he was asking why different warbler species could coexist in spruce trees. And what he did is he did really detailed observations of where the birds were in the tree and how long they spent there. And what he found is the idea that these different species, although coexisted in the trees, they didn't tend to coexist at the same time in the exact same portions of the trees. And so they subdivided their habitat in allowing for species coexistence. And that's important because it allows things to be together, yet prevents competitive exclusion. And what's happened in the last decade in particular, although this first paper was from '89, is an emergence of a field of plant behavioral ecology. And this is part of it, of how do plants react to neighbors in a way that may alter coexistence and population dynamics. And so I've been part of growing this field, as have others, and there's lots and lots of papers, and there's no shortage of papers talking about plant behavioral ecology, but I want to talk about some of the core ideas here that are relevant to this issue of coexistence. So one of the problems with viewing behavior in plants is simply that that's not how we've been typically brought up to believe what behavior is. And we have this unfortunate reality that mobile organisms are the individuals who actually created the definition of behavior. And so mobile organisms have formed the definition to exclude developmental processes. In other words, if I can walk, walking is required for behavior. It's not that simple, but that's the bulk of it. And so development has been excluded from day one, although that's bending now. The problem with this is that plants use modified development to behave through fine placement of resource acquiring organs. So this is a classic example here. This is just soil resources in hydroponics by Drew, in which he put a lot of nutrients in the middle of pots and not in the upper parts. And you can see the roots more or less went to where the food was. This is analogous. This is some work of Mark Boyce and Colleen and Cheryl, I believe, a student, looking at a grizzly bear movement. And red is low occupancy and green is high occupancy. And so, these animals were moving where there was something that they wanted or needed to spend their time. Plants are doing the same thing as the bears. They're just doing it through development rather than through movement, because they can't move. Instead, they can kill organs and they can grow more organs. And again, this comes back to Aristotle, who caused this whole problem. Because if we really think about what is an intelligent design, why would you move your entire body just to feed? It makes so much more sense to just move your mouth to where the food is, but you can keep your reproductive structures, you can keep your light acquiring organs, you can keep everything else in your home area. That way you don't have to incur all of this risk of that new environment. So animals foraging have all sorts of predation risk. And the reason is because they literally are putting their life on the line by moving to a place to feed. That's stupid. Much smarter is just put one mouth where you want to feed, but have another 1,000 mouths. And so if that's a bad spot, you don't die, you just lose the root. And so our conceptualizations of foraging are totally backwards, because we've assumed mobile organisms are the norm rather than these other approaches. And so this allows for the possibility that competition is not an inevitable outcome of living for others. And I'll just show a couple more examples. So first, this is a review we did a long time ago, just looking at what we call foraging precision. So how good are plants at putting their mouths where the food are? The higher up you are, the more precise. 50% means it's random. Nearly every species ever tested forages optimally. They put their mouths where the food is. There's very, very few exceptions. So this is a norm of plant biology. But again, this wasn't identified until the late 70s, and this isn't allowed in classical Aristotelian concepts of the soul, because this is a version of sensitivity to the local environment. We looked at other aspects of foraging. This is a former student, Gordon McNichol. Without going into the details here, just for the sake of time, he was testing a theory called the marginal value theorem, which is saying that when an animal encounters a high quality patch, they should spend more time in the patch than if they encounter a low quality patch. Gord tested this with plants, exact same finding. The plants stopped exploring the soil when they found good food, not when they found lower quality food. So again, consistent with these foraging models. This is from Pamela Belter, a master's student, looking at response to neighboring plants. She grew 2 plants together in window boxes and looked at whether a plant grew its roots towards a neighbor or away. And so this is, in modern animal behavioral parlance, this is a shyness-boldness spectrum. Do organisms avoid others, or do they tend to be bold and grow towards other or aggressive? The short is across many species. Everything, it's a big schmear. Different species consistently attack or grow right at the roots of other species, and other species consistently avoid them. And so we have this whole array of behavioral types in response to neighboring roots. And the implications for that are huge, because where the roots are is habit occupancy, and that comes to this McCarthyian idea of subdividing the environment. But it even gets more complicated. This is a study that I did with a variety of grad students, and as well as with Colleen is on this one as well. We grew a plant and we looked at its root growth as a function of the soil environment. That's this red bar. This plant, if we put patches here or no patches, it didn't matter. This plant ignored the patches. So counter what I said 2 slides ago. It just ignored the spatial distributions. It's non-sensitive. However, when we grew it next to another plant, even after controlling for differences in size, it stopped growing roots near its neighbor. So it was highly sensitive to the presence of a neighboring plant, non-sensitive to the presence of a resource patch. But when we combined those, it actually showed other behavioral types, and it was more willing to grow its roots in this shared patch. So it had patch use, but only in the presence of a neighbor. It didn't show patch use in the absence. And so this is showing that these plants are able to integrate social and resource cues so that these habitat usages of plants in foraging are extraordinarily nuanced. And this is just one species. This is a study by Megan Lucapitino, a former master's student as well, essentially doing that same experiment. This is now sunflower, and she's able to show anticipatory responses. And what she's finding is that if we grow a plant with a patch, sunflower puts more roots in the patch versus the non-patch. When you grew 2 plants together with a patch in between them, they actually underused the patch relative to expectation. But when you had two plants together, but the plant was on the far side from where the patch is, this plant actually used this patch more and faster than it did when it grew alone. In other words, this plant was somehow integrating the presence of a neighbor, the location of a patch, and the spatial orientation of the patch to the neighbor. It was integrating all of this information, resulting in three completely different foraging strategies as a response of these really minor, or well, these very complex aspects of the soil environment. And I want to say this is not surprising if this is an animal. It's also not surprising if you think about what natural selection should favor. It's only surprising if you have a classical conceptualization of what behavior is coming from Aristotle. So what's the point of this? Well, without understanding the fundamental biology of plants, I believe it is impossible to make meaningful ecological predictions, and that many disciplinary assumptions are impeding understanding and need to be challenged. And these benefits of challenging not only improve understanding, but they are feeding back. And so our work on plant behavior and others, it is changing a lot of definitions of behavior. Philosophers are involved, and people are addressing a variety of other questions that are crazy, but what plants are doing is extraordinarily nuanced. And so there's no way we can make a general model about the effects of competition on coexistence if we don't even know what plants do when they're put next to each other. I'll just end with two other slides. If you're interested, there's a couple of really interesting recent papers on dogma and groupthink. These are bibliometric analysis. This one's of 1.8 billion papers and citations from Web of Science. The context is that ecology itself is rapidly growing. These are important dates. It's my birth date, the year I got hired, and most recent full year. But you can see rapid growth in number of papers in ecology per year. And what the authors here are finding is that as a field grows, so each of these represent different fields, as it grows in size, the inequality of citations increases, which is what the Gini coefficient is. And what that means is that as a field grows, the most heavily cited papers actually get even more heavily cited, disproportionate advantage. This is a size advantage. And so there's canalization of a smaller number of papers as the field grows in size, which is exactly what we not want to have happen. And so this dogma and groupthink is real across disciplines, that people start believing, or at least using and relying on, a smaller number of very famous papers. The other bit that's important is you're also able to measure disruptiveness of work. And there's a variety of metrics for that I won't get into. And this is essentially the proportion of disruptive papers relative to confirmatory papers. Again, as a discipline grows in size, a smaller fraction of the papers are actually disruptive, and a greater proportion become confirmatory, which is very risky for every discipline unless you intentionally go against it. And the last bit on that is a different paper looking at disruptiveness as a function of how many people are on the research team. There's a very clear relationship that the larger your team becomes, the less likely you're to produce disruptive work. And this is again reinforcing the idea of groupthink and likely citation signaling and these sorts of things. So it's interesting stuff if you're curious about those patterns. That's a lot of information for today. I appreciate you all being here and listening. And again, Tracy, I appreciate you offering me this opportunity. I'll happy to take any questions.
Hey, let's have, we can have our Zoom silent hands. Yay! Thanks, JC. That was awesome. Lots and lots of stuff to think about. I think one of my favorite things you said was messiness leads to stability, and I hope that means that we're soon going to come to some more stability after the last year and a half. But questions for JC? Mark Boyce, you have your hand up.
In defense of Charles Darwin, the last paragraph in The Origin of Species crystallizes your talk, and that is about the tangled bank hypothesis, that individuals occupy different places that have different soils, they have different juxtapositions to other plants. You know, he figured it out.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, that entangled bank paragraph is great. The problem, though, is he did put in the quote that I did, and it turns out that Gauss literally chose his species for his studies because he said what Darwin said, and MacArthur included that quote. And so even though Darwin came back to it, these other authors focused in on that specific assertion and then built from it. So Darwin can be wrong about this assertion and very good in other ways.
It's good you clarified that. Rolf.
Hey, JC, I know you love taking down dogma, but I have to say, when I'm listening to your talk today, I was going, he is basically demonstrating that Hutchinson's paradox of the plankton was pretty much bang on. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it was. So Hutchinson's paradox of the plankton, yeah. So there's a variety of theories sort of trying to explain a variety of these things. The other dogma that I'm supporting is the idea that of Cahill and disturbance and non-equilibrial conditions. And so you're right. And so as we're framing the paper, what we really are going to say is that the discipline has sort of cherry-picked a certain path of dogma, but there were other ideas that were really good and that have been dropped. And if we come back to some of these ideas, maybe it reframes it. I haven't had an original idea in 25 years. I just go through the literature and figure out what it is. And it's going to be no different here. I'm just older than a lot of the readers, so they're not going to remember it. And so, yeah, but I don't disagree with you at all here, Rolf.
All right.
Aaron.
So the one thing the argument I didn't understand, I guess, is when you said that an invasive species by definition changes the system, and so that's what's going to lead to a loss of diversity. But how is that not competition? That's what I don't get. This is a plant that comes in, takes over a resource, does something that then leads to the other species disappearing. How is that not the strongest evidence of competition?
So an invasive species can come in and change the habitat and cause species loss because it changes dimensions of the niche that are non-resource based. And so, for instance, the novel weapons hypothesis is a great example. Species come in, some species like garlic mustard can come in and they disrupt the system because they produce a little chemicals that kill obligate mycorrhizal fungi. And so you get species loss because they've disrupted a mycorrhizal system. Nobody would call that competition. That just doesn't fit our rules of what competition is. And you have other situations where they can come in and they can alter soil properties differently than taking up more. Like many invasive, smooth brome is an example. Smooth brome comes in, it actually increases soil fertility. And so it's not the classical competition. And so when you look at the specific mechanisms of competition with invasives, competition is almost always inferred, but it is extremely rarely actually demonstrated. And this is what I mean is it makes sense that it's competitive, but there's 50 other niche axes that these species might be disrupting other than a resource-based competition thing. And so that's dead on of what we're trying to sort out with our smooth brome work, which I didn't talk about and other stuff. Yeah.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Victoria.
I just wanted to jump on the same comment that Aaron made, JC. And I wanted to ask you about this ordination that you showed, which I think is a meta-analysis of your experiments on Kinsella. So where did invasion come in? Because you did lots of invasion studies. Did you include that as an effect in your ordination?
No, that one we didn't. We've never done a manipulative study of invasives. And so we've done a lot of invasion work and manipulated some areas that were invaded. But because it wasn't a classic, like we didn't plant in smooth brome or something else that would have allowed to do that. So that one actually has, although it has a lot of climate change in there, there's no invasion in that particular analysis.
And also very similar to what Aaron said, I mean, we don't know how smooth brome behaves in its native range. It might be just a very, superb competitor in Eurasia. And what we're seeing here is just the effect of a strong competitor.
It might be. I mean, it all, what we think is going on for smooth brome, the reason it's killing things here, we think, is because it simply produces so much dead matter. And so it prevents light, like normal light penetration is down to 10% in the grassland, maybe 5%. It has like 0 light penetration. And it also increases humidity. So we know it changes the microbial and probably increases disease risk. And so you could call those competitive characteristics, but it just isn't parsimonious.
Yeah,
Rather,
and,
yeah.
and I think I mentioned this, I don't know in what context, maybe a committee meeting, is that the two most invasive grasses we see in the prairies, smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass, also known to be very invasive or very competitive in their native range. So they produce lots of litter. Yeah, I think there should be more comparative studies.
Yeah, and just to wrap that up, and also going back to Aaron's point, an invader can be, the system can collapse if an invader comes in and reduces heterogeneity of conditions. And that's what I think is going on for a lot of the invasive species. It's not necessarily competition, but they're decreasing the complexity of niche space. And, and you can call that competition, but it's not classical version of competition.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Rolf, is that a new hand or an old hand? A new one?
It's a new hand.
What? Go for it.
JC, in your ordination that you explained really nicely to anyone who doesn't do ordinations, I was kind of struck by the fact like you've got the competition vectors that show that the competition evidence from your studies doesn't really play a very big role. Then you've got all the other environmental manipulations that you show have all kinds of an array of pretty dramatic effects. And then I was going, if you were to, instead of looking at competition, and maybe you've done this somewhere in your career, flip it around and say, what's the role then of facilitative interactions between species, particularly given the sense that you're doing all these environmental perturbations where the stress facilitation hypothesis should kind of pop out?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I mentioned Emily a few times, even though I didn't show much of her data. What she's actually doing is she's doing a light and resource big experiment and incorporating the size stuff. And then she's doing this in a network framework. And so we're looking at the network of interactions with resource manipulation and light spectral qualities and trait stuff. And she's exactly trying to get at that. She's looking to see if certain conditions switch towards facilitative versus antagonistic interactions. So yeah, I mean, I agree that that might be going on. I don't think we can do it that easily with our old data. I don't think the data is clean enough. But that's one of her major goals in her thesis here, is to tease this apart.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Other questions? Right. Thank you so much, JC. There was I feel like I wish we were really in person and we had, snacks and drinks. This could go on for a long time, but really appreciate it. Everybody join me in thanking JC for a great talk. I feel like I know you a lot better. And I will just put out a plea that there's still a spot in November available in the Chairs Lecture Series. So reach out if you want to be a part of this, and have a great end of your week, everybody. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks,
everyone.
Nice job.